We will take this RC, this is a short RC because it has only three questions, and the passage is relatively shorter than the other passages. This passage came in CAT 2017, and we will read the passage first, which is there on the left hand side, and then we will take the questions, which is there on the right hand side. The first para says, scientists have long recognized the incredible diversity within a species, but they thought it reflected evolutionary changes that unfolded imperceptibly over millions of years. The divergence between populations within a species was enforced according to Ernst Mayr, the great evolutionary biologist, when a population was separated from the rest of the species by a mountain range or a desert, preventing breeding across the divide over geologic scales of time. Without the separation, gene flow was relentless. But as the separation persisted, the isolated population grew apart and speciation occurred. Now, what do you mean by the word speciation? And the author seems to be talking about some biological subject, and the author's purpose is to discuss diversity within a species, right? And there is Mr. Meyer, who is of the opinion that when a population was separated from the rest of the species by a mountain range or desert preventing breeding across the divide, uh, it resulted in what we call as the population growing apart and speciation occurred. So basically, what do you have here? That diversity, according to Mr. Meyer, is a result of populations being apart. And because they are apart, they cannot breed with each other. And that's the reason why the speciation occurred. Let's go and have a look at the second paragraph. In the mid 1960s, the biologist Paul Ehrlich and the author of Population Bomb and his Stanford University colleague Peter Raven challenged Meyer's ideas. So there are two people who are challenging Meyer's ideas. They had studied checkered spot butterflies living in the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve in California, and it soon became clear. Now, this becomes very important. So, many a time you should focus on what is important, what is not important. In the earlier passage, we know that Meyer believed that because of isolation, the speciation occurred. Paul and his colleague are challenging that, and they believe that that they were not examining a single population. Now, what is this single population? This is about the checker spot butterflies. Though through years of capturing, marking, and then recapturing the butterflies, they were able to prove that within the population, spread over just 50 acres of suitable checker spot habitat, there were three groups that rarely interacted despite their very close proximity. So, this is very important. Three groups rarely interacted despite the proximity. Now, this becomes critical to our understanding. Meyer said that isolation is very important for a speciation to occur because they won't breed. And here, the other two people who challenge Meyer say that within a span of that there were three groups of checker spot butterflies, right? Checker spot butterflies that rarely interacted despite being in very close proximity. So there must be some other reason. This is what the question Mr. Paul and Peter are raising. Among the other ideas, Ehrlich and Raven argued in a now classic paper from 1969 that gene flow was not as predictable and ubiquitous as Meyer and his cohort maintained. And thus, evolutionary divergence between neighboring groups in a population was probably common. They also asserted that isolation and gene flow were less important to evolutionary divergence than natural selection. So what? So here we have natural selection, which is which is which as per Meyer and which as per Paul and Peter is important. So Paul Peter says that isolation and gene flow were less important compared to what natural selection. When such factors such as mate choice, weather, disease, or predation cause better adapted individuals to survive and pass on their successful genetic traits. For example, Paul and Peter suggested that without the force of natural selection, an isolated population would remain unchanged, and that in other scenarios, natural selection could be strong enough to overpower gene flow. So this is a very, very important statement. Mr. Ehrlich and Raven believe that natural selection could be strong enough to overpower gene flow. So here we have opinions of two different groups. The first group is Mr. Meyer, who believes that speciation happens because of isolation, and then we have Paul and Peter who believe that speciation may not necessarily happen because of isolation, because when they experimented with the checker spot butterflies, they realized that even though they were in close proximity, there were three groups that never interacted with each other. That means there is something else, and that something else is natural selection. So that is how you have to summarize the whole passage. And it's a very, very simple passage. There is not much of complexity. We can go ahead and take the questions, right? Now we have the questions on the right hand side. So let's go to the first question. It says, which of the following best sums up Eric and Raven's argument? Now, Eric and Raven have come in the second half. They talk about natural selection being more important than the gene flow. So which option is focusing on that? Ernst Mayr was wrong in identifying physical separation as the cause of species diversity. So, which are the following subs? So, what is their argument? Is their argument that Ernst Mayr was wrong in identifying physical separation as the cause of species diversity? Maybe yes, maybe no. Probably yes. But is that the focus of the 1969 paper? Because if you look at it, here it says that if you scroll down below, what do we have? It says here that suggested that without the force of natural selection, an isolated population would remain unchanged, and that in other scenarios, natural selection could be strong enough. In other scenarios, natural selection could be strong enough. So, what is Raymond and Ehrlich doing? They are basically coming up with a new theory. The theory is not to say that you are wrong. I mean, that is fine. I mean, that doesn't say that Ernst Mayr was wrong in identifying physical separation as the cause of species diversity. Uh, the Eric and Raven believe that it was not as much an important factor as the other factor. So look at C now. While a factor, isolation was not as important. This is a very, very important word that you have to understand. Option A says that Meyer was completely wrong, whereas C says that isolation was not as important. So that is what we have to understand, correct? And if you look at the argument given by Ehrlich and Raven, you will realize that they also asserted that isolation gene flow were less important. So this is very important word, they were less important than natural selection. That means he does not say that it is not important. So option A puts Mr. Meyer completely in the negative, whereas option C says that isolation was not as important. So this is precisely what Meyer has to say in his paper. C is better than A. Right? Gene flow is less common and more erratic than Meyer and his colleagues claimed. Is it about gene flow particularly? This is not what he's saying in his paper. His paper is more focused on the effect of natural selection, whereas option D says gene flow is less common and more erratic. You simply say it is less common and more erratic. I don't know what is more erratic than Meyer and his colleagues claimed. I doubt this word more erratic, nowhere seen in the passage. So it is just it's distorting what we have in the passage. So D goes out. And checker spot butterflies in the 50-acre formed the three groups that rarely interacted with each other. But see, this was the experiment that they had done. So this was basically the experiment through which they came to see as a conclusion. So if you look at the best option that sums up the argument was not about checker spot rarely interacted. That was the evidence that they gathered, and from that they concluded finally that isolation was not as important. So C is better in terms of what it is capturing than the other choices, and therefore C is the best answer. Let's come to 2. All of the following statements are true according to the passage. So we have to find the one that is not true. Why? Because the question is focusing on except. So the one that is not true becomes the right answer. A says gene flow contributes to evolutionary divergence. Now, if you look at this, gene flow contributes to evolutionary divergence. That means basically, if you look at if you look at this here, it says here, right? Without the separation, gene flow was relentless. That means if the gene flow is there, then there is no divergence. If the gene flow is not there, then there is divergence, right? So the presence or the absence, understand this, the presence or the absence of the gene flow contributes to evolutionary divergence. Correct? So if the gene flow is there, then it will not create divergence. Of course, gene flow is playing a role. And evolutionary changes unfold imperceptibly. Definitely, if you look at this option C, it is given straight away from the passage that evolutionary changes that unfold imperceptibly over millions of years. Evolutionary changes definitely happen. That is not getting denied. But what is an important factor in evolutionary change is the debate. So the author is not denying that evolutionary changes don't happen. In fact, Meyer says that the changes happen because of isolation, whereas the other two believe that changes happen because of natural selection. So it is not that changes don't happen. That is definitely happening. That's why evolutionary changes unfold over time. This is correct. And because this is correct, this is not the right choice. Because this also is correct, this is not the right choice, right? And checker spot butterflies are known to exhibit speciation while living in close. Yes, they exhibit because there are three groups. Three groups, they never interacted with each other. So that means they are exhibiting speciation while living in close proximity. So even D looks good. So the only option we are left with is B. The population bomb question dominant ideas about species diversity. Now the point is that when you go to say, let's say you go to B and you say why B is wrong. The population bomb, which was published in 1968, it challenged Mayer's ideas. So Mayer's ideas was not the dominant belief, right? If you look at the whole passage, it says that the divergence between populations within a species, according to Answer, when a population was separated from the rest of the species. So this is Mayer's view. Whether Mayer's view is the dominant view or not, that we don't know. So the problem with option B is that the population bomb did question, but it did not question the dominant ideas. It questioned Mayer's ideas. And therefore, option B is definitely not correct as per the passage. And that's why in the case of accept question, B becomes the right choice. Many of you might be wondering that, Mayer's view can be dominant view. Mayer's views is not equal to dominant views because the passage is not very clear on that, and therefore definitely B becomes the right choice, right? So let's go and have a look at the third question. The author discusses Meyer, Ehrlich, and Raymond to demonstrate that. Now, what is the purpose of discussing Meyer, Ehrlich, and all the others? To check about species divergence and how it happens, right? So, evolution is a sensitive and it is not a controversial topic. See, controversial and sensitive is with respect to human society, human issues. You can't say that evolution is a sensitive topic. What is so sensitive in evolution? It might be controversial, definitely, but it is not sensitive. So I would not use the word sensitive here. Eric and Raven's ideas about evolutionary divergence are widely accepted by scientists. Now, the problem is that Eric and Raven definitely have come up with an opinion. But whether that opinion is widely accepted or not, that is something we don't have in the passage. Because towards the end, the author says that Eric and Raven suggested something that natural selection could be strong enough to overpower gene flow. But whether its acceptance has been universal or not is not something coming clearly from the passage. So the causes of speciation are debated by whom? By the scientists. So we have Meyer, who is a scientist. We have Elric, who is a scientist. We have Raven. So the causes, of course, are being debated because one party believes that it is isolation which is responsible for speciation, whereas the other two believe that it is natural selection. C looks good in every way. Checker spot butterflies offer the best example. Now the point is that is it the best example or not? We don't know. It is definitely an example, no doubt about it. But is it the best example? And checker spot butterflies has not been included in Meyer's research or experimentation. So how can we connect checker spot butterflies with Meyer? And secondly, it is not the best example. So this also goes out. C is the best choice and the right answer. I would say overall a very, very